Risk management. The thing that could sneak up and bite you is the very thing you need to plan for when you're working on a project. You need to have all of your risks listed, managed, and have a plan in place to deal with them because they will sneak up and bite you. Let's talk about how we can prepare yourself for that to happen. Project risk management. We're going to define what that is and the importance of managing risk. There are 4 ways to handle risk, which we'll talk about. And we're going to talk about risk management processes, where we plan risk management, identify risks, evaluate risks, and we talk about planned risk responses. And then we'll talk about project risk by phases. Project risk definition. Project risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on one or more project objectives, such as scope, schedule, cost, and quality. A risk may have one or more causes. A risk may have one or more impacts. Project risk is more than the sum of the identified risks. There's an overarching risk to the project as well. What can be done about risks? You can do one of 4 things. You can avoid a risk, you can transfer a risk, you can mitigate a risk, and you can accept a risk. The project manager's job is to identify all the risks possible that would hinder the project from executing well or hinder the project from delivering on the outcomes that's agreed to by the stakeholders. Here's an example. Before paint can be applied, the surface must be cleaned. Toxic chemicals are one method of cleaning. Here's the risk. Someone may injure their skin or their eyes due to a spill or splash of chemical. So here are your options to handling that risk. To avoid the risk, you may find another method of cleaning. To transfer the risk, you may get insurance on the workers. If the toxic exposure is based on time limits, then you use a larger workforce for a shorter amount of time. You could reduce the probability of injury by requiring protective equipment such as clothing and safety goggles and a mask, and you provide training to those workers as well as information on how to apply the chemicals. Then you can also reduce the degree or impact of the possible injury by ensuring that off-site first aid attendants are available, including eye wash stations and etc. Or you could simply accept the risk and do nothing. Here's some other definitions of risk you need to know as a project manager. You have risk appetite, and that's basically the degree of uncertainty of an entity that the company or the project team is willing to take on in anticipation of a reward. Risk tolerance. What is the degree, amount, or volume of risk that an organization or individual will withstand? In other words, how much risk can the organization take on when you take this project on? Risk threshold. There's a point above which a stakeholder or organization is no longer willing to accept the level of uncertainty or impact, because the threshold will determine what types of decisions the organization is willing to make to continue your project and to tolerate as well as understand the appetite of risk that the organization has for the project. Plan risk management. Here's the process. First thing you must do is you must make an overall plan of how the project will identify, track, and respond to risks. The inputs for this plan come from the project plan, the charter, the shareholder register, the enterprise environmental factors, as well as organizational process assets. The tools that you use to identify those risks are analytical techniques, expert judgment, as well as meetings to discuss what the risk is going to be for the project. The outputs of the process is a risk management plan. Note that this becomes input into the other 4 risk management processes, where you identify risks, perform qualitative analysis on risk, perform quantitative analysis on risk, as well as the planned risk responses. The comment here is that the complexity of the risk management plan will vary with the complexity of the overall project. Here's how we identify risks. We take those inputs from most of the documents that you've already created for the project, as well as environmental factors and organizational processes to develop what risk you may have. As a part of the tools and techniques for identifying risk, you do things like fact-finding through documentation reviews. You also do a risk breakdown structure based on the work breakdown structure and all the things you have to accomplish for the project. What are the risks involved with doing that work and those work packages? You also can use diagramming techniques to find out all of the risks that you have for a project. You can use a SWOT analysis, which involves identifying the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of your project. And also you can use expert judgment as a tool and technique for identifying those risks. Once you've identified them, analyzed them, and come up with your plan for dealing with them, your output is going to be a risk register where you list all the risks, how you're going to respond, the probability of that risk occurring, the impact of that risk occurring, so that you can manage those risks throughout the duration of the project. A risk breakdown structure simply involves groups and the categorized risks and identifies the response or the mitigation of those risks. The risk register is a list of identified risks, a list of potential responses. And over the life of the project, you add updates to the probabilities of the risk occurring. You add information on occurrences, if any. You also add information on actual responses and the success or lack of success of those responses. Controlling risks. Throughout the project manager must continue to update the risk register and new risks are identified, and the project retires consideration of risks that are no longer possible. The risk reassessments and risk audits can be used to monitor and control the risk management process. There are costs associated with the contingency reserve, so if it can be identified that some portion of this reserve can be released, it is a benefit to the organization and to the project. Project change management. Identification of a risk or occurrence of a risk may create a need for a project change. Change management is part of the project integration management knowledge group. A typical change management process includes identifying the change request, considering the impacts and cost, make a decision, identify what plans must be updated, inform affected stakeholders of the decision, and proceeding with dealing with the change. The levels of risk change throughout the project. The risk over time profile may be typical in certain project types. Early for projects that use new technology, late for politically sensitive projects. During procurement, this is where a large portion of the budget occurs. So when we're talking about risk, this is where we like to focus. In summary, project risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on one or more project objectives, such as scope, schedule, cost, and quality. A risk may have one or more causes, or a risk may have one or more impacts. Here are the risk management processes we discussed. We plan risk management, we identify the risks, we perform qualitative risk analysis, we perform quantitative risk analysis, we plan risk responses, and then we control risk as we execute the project. Risk management is a process as a part of the planning process group. Also, risk management processes are in the monitoring and controlling process group.